Tell me if this sounds familiar. We have a number of companies that talk about customer experience, but the delivery is a little bit bumpy.
On today's episode of Confessions of a CX Executive, JP is joined by Orlando Hampton. We're talking about the good IVRs and the really bad ones.
Talking to several humans, multiple IVRs, filling out the paperwork in the office. Every time you are transferred, your customer experience drops by about 20%.
What's the one thing that you would change about an IVR to improve that experience? Hey, welcome to this week's edition of Confessions of a CX Executive. My name is JP Dumas. As you know, I've spent more than 25 years leading some fairly large brands in the areas of sales, customer retention, and operations. So now I come to you as the founder and CEO of CX and Growth Strategies, where we help small companies as well as mid-sized ones elevate their employee and customer experience so that they can increase revenue and reduce churn. So I want to walk you through a scenario today. Tell me if this sounds familiar. We have a number of companies that talk about customer experience, but the delivery is a little bit bumpy. So let's try this on for size. Boop, 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 boop. Hello, thank you for calling Acme Corporation. Agent. So if you've had that experience, then today's session is for you. We're going to talk about IVRs, also known as interactive voice response systems, but you all know them as phone trees. So today's guest on Confessions of a CX Executive is Orlando Hampton. Now, he spent more than 30 years in the contact center space. He knows all things customer experience, and he'll share a little bit about some of his experiences being not only an operator, but also as a customer as we deal with those pesky little IVR situations. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Orlando. He's going to tell you a little bit about himself, and then we're going to jump into our session.
Hey, JP, I'm thrilled to be here. And let me just tell you a little bit about my background. As you hit it, I've been in the contact center space for 3 decades now. I actually started off as an agent and worked every job you can imagine in a contact center, from supervisor to trainer, shift manager, regional manager, to moving up to account. So at every level, I learned more. When I was a call center agent, I literally thought the manager of the call center owned the company. I thought that was the end of the business. I didn't know that there was more outside of that, but this business has literally taken me all over the world. I left my first call center job and took a job at Providian Financial, where I managed call center vendors. And so I moved from Pittsburgh, my hometown, all the way to San Francisco. And that was really my first kind of trip anywhere. I think it was close to one of my first flights ever at the time when I first went out to California. And then from there, I've just really seen the world. In Providian, we started the process of outsourcing calls, offshoring calls to India. We were one of the first places to ever send calls to India. And so I ended up being one of the first people to ever work with outsourcers in India, which at the time was an incredible experience because they had no experience at all in contact centers. And so it wasn't just your normal management of vendors. It was actually more like running the operation. And so I spent a lot of time flying back and forth between the West Coast and back and forth to Asia. I left Providian and joined JP Morgan Chase, where I actually ran contact center operations for Chase Card. So I was responsible for the internal centers as well as the outsourcers at JP Morgan. Again, we end up building our own captive centers in India and the Philippines as well. So still doing a lot of travel back and forth to Asia. And finally, about 17 years ago, I joined a startup at the time. And I should put startup in quotes because I was the third employee. There were only 3 of us. But that went on to become Affinity, which was a company dedicated to bringing artificial intelligence to the contact center space, and in particular, driving behavioral parents to improve customer pairing, right? So it was an amazing thing, amazing technology at the time. 17 years ago, actually, when you would go in and talk about artificial intelligence, nobody knew what that was. The number one thing people would say when you brought up AI, for whatever reason, was Terminator. Terminator had invoked a memory for everyone. And so in the early days, our presentations were primarily around what artificial intelligence is before we could even get into like what we do. And so I did pretty much every job. I was the only non-engineer, non-mathematician in the early days. And so anything that didn't require coding or technical knowledge was kind of my area. So I essentially went around setting the bar very low in every department, whether it was legal or marketing or finance, and until we could actually, find competent professionals. And I ended up landing in the client services role. And so up until 2 months ago, I was the chief customer officer, just responsible for, managing our biggest accounts. And obviously, working at a startup, everybody's in sales. And so I had a pretty hefty business development function too. So I am a call center person at heart. I've been in this business for a very long time, and I managed to find my way into artificial intelligence almost 2 decades ago. And so this marriage of artificial intelligence and customer experience is really just my wheelhouse. And I'm super excited to be here. I see all the stuff that you were doing. I'm impressed by it. I'm telling everyone who will listen that they need to tune in. So hopefully we have some folks here listening to you today.
Absolutely. And since you mentioned artificial intelligence, I'm going to blame you for the AI boom, but that's okay because we're going to talk a little bit about that. So this is my opportunity to ask a few questions since I'm on the other side of the mic. And so I'm going to try to keep this as high level as I can. So today's topic is really about the IVR, the interactive voice response unit, and as I talked about at the top. So my question is, can you remember the last time you got stuck in a terrible phone tree situation? How did you feel? And let's talk a little bit about what happened. But the most important piece is, take off your customer experience hat for a second and tell me how it felt as a customer.
This is so important to think about this. I used to refer to this as drinking our own champagne. People normally call it dog fooding, but
Yeah.
I think if you're delivering a premium product, I would call it drinking our own champagne and going through the systems. But it's interesting to put on the hat as totally being a customer, right? Not some internal audit, but like, what does the customer feel? So I'll tell you something that just happened to me just recently. Like, this is a very recent story. So I had to schedule a colonoscopy. I am at the age where everyone should go out and do it. And just a public service, if you're out there and you're listening to this message and you're around 45, 50 years old, it's time. Get in there and get that colonoscopy because it's preventive is the best way to go around this. And so I started the process with speaking to my primary care physician, and she said, "Hey, it's time. You have to go get this colonoscopy." So we arranged the whole thing. It was all set up. It was perfect. And so I just simply had to call and get registered at the place. And so I called, and of course, I was immediately answered by a human, actually, who answered the phone, asked me a couple questions, wanted to know my name. I spelled my name, gave her my date of birth, and she said, "Awesome, let me transfer you." And she transferred me to an IVR system. And so I figured, okay, this would be an IVR system that might, maybe the first person was just, directing calls and trying to send me to the right place. So now I'm at the right place. And the IVR system immediately asked me for my name and my date of birth, which I just given to the lady, but fine, right? There was no transfer data. So I gave the information into the IVR. I answered a few questions, and then the IVR said, "Please hold, I'm going to transfer you." And the IVR transferred me to a person. And it was another person. And the person said, "Thanks for calling." Like, they had no idea, like, that I'd spoken to anyone at this point. And of course, that person started off by confirming my name and date of birth. And then I answered several questions for that person, and they said, "Okay, let me transfer you to the office." And when I got transferred to the office, it was in fact an IVR who immediately asked me for my name and date of birth, and then a few other questions. Like, so it was like getting down to the medical questions. What insurance do you have? What allergies do you have? Can you give us some demographic information? And so I figured, okay, well, at least I'm making progress, right? I'm getting deeper into the system. And so I gave all the information. And I said, "Thank you so much for your time. We're going to send you a text message at the end of this call." And so I actually thought the text message might have been like a typical survey. And so when I ended the call, I immediately received the text message. It was a link. I clicked on the link, And what do you know? They wanted me to enter my name and date of birth. And it was a whole thing where I had to fill out information about myself, all of the information that I had just given to either one of the two humans or one of the two IVRs that I had spoken to. And so at this point, this is when my own CX hat kind of kicked in. And I start looking at the timer on the phone. I start calculating how long I was spending. I was 26 minutes into the interaction at this point, and I was like, okay, let me just see, where this goes. And so I filled out all the forms, and which was like difficult, tapping on my little phone screen, like typing in my address and all this information. And I submitted it, and it was great. I received another text back confirming the time of my appointment. I show up for the appointment, and they're like, "Hey, thank you for filling out everything online." And then they immediately handed me a clipboard with a bunch of papers on there. And you wouldn't believe it, but the first thing was name and date of birth. And I ended up filling all the manual papers out as well. And so ultimately, what I figured out is talking to several humans, multiple IVRs, filling out a link, filling out the paperwork in the office. I spent somewhere in the neighborhood of around 45 minutes getting registered for the appointment to actually just see the doctor, to only talk about a colonoscopy at that point. So the talk itself lasted, I think, 11 minutes. And so that was my experience just recently of like a challenging IVR system.
So much to unpack here. I'm glad we are meeting in this place today. But the experience that you just described isn't that unusual. I mean, actually, the company, if you look back, is probably thinking they're doing all the right things, but it's to help them, not necessarily help you as a customer. So that becomes problematic, the fact that the amount of time, and not to mention energy, the frustration level, the friction, that's a problem. So my next question for you then, based on all of that, because my goodness, when you hear that your call is important to us and you're valued, what do you think, just based on that statement alone?
I always hear that message and assume that what it really means is behind the curtain that they are understaffed, that either the number of agents is inadequate to deal with the call volume at this time, or they don't have the appropriate systems in place to be able to deal with these calls. And I'll tell you what my particular perspective on this is someone who is, I was in the enterprise AI software sales world, and this may be a bit of a tangent, but in order to sell our product, at some point, we decided that this apex level approach was the most effective way. And so I spent a lot of time selling at the C-suite, selling at the board level, talking to high-powered executives around these products. And one thing that was always interesting to me was the disconnect between the top of the house and the front line. So I would talk to a CEO and they would say something along the lines of, our customers are incredibly important to us. And because of that, we never let a customer wait. When a customer calls in, there's an agent ready for them who can speak to them because we value speaking to that customer. And then I would go all the way down to the front line and speak to a call center manager, and they would say something like, the most important thing for me is that I keep my agents busy and that people are not sitting around and not taking calls. And because of that, we keep customers in queue so that agents are always busy. And there's always a customer for an agent to talk to the moment that they are available. Now, the thing about that is both of those approaches have merit. They both make sense when you think about the goals of the individuals telling you that. But they are incredibly counter to each other, and they live within the same organization often. So people in the executive side will think that this is how we handle customers, and people on the operations side have decided that actually efficiency is the best way for us to handle ourselves. So to your point, a lot of times the systems are set up to be comfortable for the company, not necessarily comfortable for the customer. And so that's kind of the hidden message that I hear when I hear the words that your call is important to us.
So we're definitely going to get in trouble here because what we just exposed is the disconnect between the strategy and the execution. And guess what? It's not that uncommon to have that disconnect. Okay, so with that said, you know, given the experience that you've had, given the experiences we've had in our career with these different pieces, what's the one thing that you would change about an IVR to improve that experience?
This is so interesting to me because I think about this often actually, and I think the one thing, if I could only change one thing, I would change the sensitivity of the IVR around when the customer is getting frustrated because everyone has a different everyone prefers different things, right? And so there are customers who maybe their DIY, their do-it-yourself score is very high, and they prefer a do-it-yourself solution. They actually don't want to speak to an agent. They want to solve this issue themselves through an IVR or through a bot or through the internet, some way of not dealing with people. They're fine doing that. There are other customers who have very low DIY scores. And so even though this is a simple thing that an IVR can answer. An IVR can tell you the hours of operation. It can tell you the location of the business. But this customer doesn't want that. They want to speak to a human. They want to speak to a person. And there's a moment in the conversation where the friction starts to build. There's a moment where the customer starts to lose patience with an IVR, right? And maybe that moment is when you say, press one or say yes. And then they say something and the IVR says, I didn't understand you. Press one or say yes. I think by the second time that the IVR doesn't understand you, it's time to bail. It is time to immediately find an agent, find a solution. And I find that the systems that react well to that, they have a sense that, hey, this customer is not connecting well, there's some frustration, and it bails quickly. I think that's the way to go. When the worst is when it never bails. It just goes into a loop and it's willing to sit there 15 times with you saying, I didn't understand that. Please say it again.
Yes.
That's my personal pet peeve.
Yes, I don't think customers, well, I don't think, I know customers do not want to roll around in the dirt with technology. There needs to be a quick way to offload those sort of sensitive situations to a human immediately. So, so I think there's a couple of things here. One, it's contextual because as you mentioned, customers' needs are different at different times. So the DIYer may also be a person who needs to be heavily involved with other things depending on the context. So the business, the more we personalize and understand our customers, and through the AI solutions that you're very familiar with, that's going to allow us to understand what's likely going on with this customer. And through that sentiment analysis, we understand that we need to move them pretty quickly. So I think the context is very important in terms of what we do. But to the point you articulated, people don't hate bots. They don't hate technology. They hate bad technology. So the quicker that you can understand what this customer's need is and get them offloaded to where they need to go, the better the experience. Because I actually believe the customers will give you grace in that particular area. Just get it done right.
Yeah, you've hit on something that really resonates with me because I've been preaching this a lot lately, this idea around technology adoption, right? So I'm a firm believer that technology adoption is not driven by the efficacy of the technology. It's driven by the willingness of the customers to engage in that technology, right? So I'll say this from like an old banking example. I'm a banker at heart. And in the banking world, when the automated teller machine was introduced, there's not a big difference between ATMs literally today and the ATM machines of 25 years ago. The feature set has not changed a great deal. And what I mean by that is 25 years ago, you could have rolled out an ATM that had many of the features that you have today. And some banks did. They put an ATM out there that said, you can withdraw money, you can deposit money, you can put a check in, you can check your balance. I'll tell you what happened though. Those banks that put those machines out, customers tried it, were overwhelmed, immediately went in the bank, and they were dealing with the teller for the next 5 years. They had low adoption of the ATM. The banks that actually won, the banks that got people to adopt quickly to the ATM, they limited the functions to the services that the machine did flawlessly. So they literally just put a machine out front and said, this machine does one thing. You put a card in, a 4-digit PIN, and it's going to give you $20. It just gives you money in increments of $20, and that's it. And guess what? It did that flawlessly every time. You take $20 out, you look in your account, it's $20 less. And because it did that one thing flawlessly, customers were delighted by it. It was like, this really works. This is amazing. And as they introduce new things, hey, you can put money into the ATM. Well, guess what? Those customers were more willing to try that next experience. And so I see that today as like, I see that especially in AI. I see people coming with like these agentic bots, and they're like, this bot does everything: sales, retention, customer service, speaks 90 languages,
Yeah.
is impressive, also technical. And I think to myself, is that bot doing all of those functions flawlessly? And if the answer to that is no, and take it from someone who knows the tech, the answer to that is no. That
The
bot is
answer is
not
very
doing all
much
these
no.
things flawlessly.
The answer is very much
Yeah,
no.
yeah,
Or
yeah.
absolutely no. You touched on that very, very well. It's oh boy. I think that's going to lead us into a question here, because if you think about from an AI perspective, in some of the things we've been talking about, let's pull on this thread a little bit. So is this bot and this technology with AI and these agentic agents, are they just fancier versions of an IVR?
In many ways, the answer to that is yes. It's an improvement upon the traditional IVR technology. And if I was in the business of selling agentic bots today, that's actually where I would aim. I would aim at these, legacy IVR systems where, anytime I'm next to someone on a plane and I hear them saying yes, they're saying password,
Agent.
please. Yes, and I just, they're saying, what is your password? And they're saying, big boy, big boy. I think that person would much rather prefer to speak to some kind of agentic bot where they can actually just say, here's the reason I'm calling. Can you help me with this reason? And you're not actually going through these phone trees. So I do think that the agentic bot is a step forward. It's kind of an advancement in this IVR technology. But to me, and this is something I'm really passionate about, in the way that technology evolves, there's like a typical cycle that happens. And that is that when the technology first comes out, the first thing we do with that technology is what we already did before. We just do it better or faster or more efficiently. And you can look through this through like any technologies, right? Like the very first radio shows were literally just vaudeville performances on radio. So somebody just went to a vaudeville performance and broadcasted over radio. And for a while, those were radio shows. But the breakthrough for radio wasn't actually that. The breakthrough was when radio started doing things that could never be done before. When radio started broadcasting live sports, this was the first time anyone had ever heard sports at the same time everywhere. Live concerts was the first time anyone had ever sung in California and been heard in London. And so that was the actual breakthrough, when you do things that you've never done before. And so I'm a big passionate believer around this. When you think about like AI or any technology from this standpoint, is they all start with this idea of just doing what we've already done before. I promise you, before generative AI existed, people wrote emails, they wrote presentations, they wrote text messages, they wrote decks, they did analysis. And what we're doing at this point is people are just finding out, oh, you can do it faster, right? You can do it quicker. But that's not the breakthrough. The breakthrough will be when we actually apply this technology to do things that we never did before.
No, absolutely great point. So we covered a lot today. I think we've all had the experience of the bad interaction, the bad engagement, the as I would say, the rough customer experience. But let's give our audience a little bit of hope here. Are there any companies out there that are doing this right?
There's some really smart thinkers in this space, right? So I actually was just doing a study with some of the folks at Verizon and looking at what they were doing and their operations, and it's smart. They're working towards a frictionless encounter. So if you think about it, every call in to a contact center is in its way a very small way of registering a complaint. What I mean by that is no one actually signs up for mobile service in the hope that they'll be calling you at some point. No one signs up for your cable service in the hope that one day they'll be calling you or your bank or anything. And so for a customer, a truly frictionless experience is one where I actually don't have to contact you. When I have to contact you kind of through any form, it's kind of a silent logging of a complaint. It doesn't always come to us as a complaint. It might come to you as, hey, I want to transfer balance to my credit card. Hey, I want to add a second phone line. Those don't sound like complaints, but I promise you, if there was a way to do this without calling you, many customers would have attempted to do that. And so when you approach the calls that way and you start to think, okay, you're already at some level of friction. The call does not start at zero. Just the means of the customer calling in means that there's some friction here. And so it's important to reduce the friction moving forward, right? You want to make everything easier. If there's just a little bit of friction, then I get a bad experience in your IVR. Now the friction is greater. If I get to an agent who doesn't have the information, now the experience is greater. If you have to transfer me, transfer is the death of customer experience, right? There's some good data out there from Gartner and others around the impacts of transfer. Basically, every time you are transferred, your customer experience drops by about 20%. So if you talk to an agent and that agent has to transfer you to the retention department or technical support department, that drops by some amount. And so I was talking to these folks at Verizon actually, and they were talking about like this idea of building a frictionless environment, this idea of having customers not have to deal with these transfers, right? So how do you create that? Can you augment the agent with enough information? Maybe this is the use of AI that goes back to my point of doing something that we've never done before. Suddenly, the agent has AI on their side and they have more information. So, what if the agent was aware that you had been on the website? What if the agent was aware that you had stopped by one of the stores? What if the agent was aware that there was a network outage before you called in? Then all of these things reduce friction. And I think the companies that are actively thinking about reducing the friction on those calls, to me, those are the winners.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's a great summation because ultimately it's about being proactive where that engagement doesn't need to occur. Now, we spent a lot of time talking about contact centers today within the context of the customer experience. And it's largely because if you think about many companies, you're going to have some sort of digital experience, a retail experience, maybe a field rep experience, but in a large cases, it's going to be through a contact center. And so that's why we've spent a lot of time talking about it today because it is a treasure trove of information about the company, what the customers value, what they don't value, and some things they like to see done a little bit differently to make that leap. The way I think about contact centers is each interaction, to your point, is an opportunity to drive loyalty from a proactive retention perspective. You've made the right choice. You're in great hands, and we're going to give you a great experience so that you continue as a customer. So, Orlando, I want to thank you once again for joining us today in this episode of Confessions of a CX Executive. Do you have any parting words for for our audience as a takeaway?
I do. My parting word is that you should understand in your organization that the average contact center agent speaks to more customers in a month than the average executive would speak to during their entire career. Your customer experience is that conversation with the agent. It's not your television commercials. It's not your marketing and your advertising. It's when they pick up the phone and call you, that experience they have, that is their customer experience. And so you have to prioritize your agents and your business. These are not merely order takers. They're actually representing you from the customer. And if they delight the customer, your company is delightful. If they miss, your company just missed.
There you have it, folks. This week's edition of Confessions of a CX Executive. Once again, I'd like to thank my guest, Orlando Hampton, for insightful comments. I'm JP Dumas, founder and CEO of CX and Growth Strategies. If this message resonated with you, drop me a comment. I'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe and comment on all of the things that we've talked about, as well as check out our archive of great customer experience information. Once again, we'll see you next week.